What if the one thing you trusted to protect your family, to secure your future, could be taken from you? Not by a thief in the night, not by a market crash, but by a single sheet of paper, signed by your own government. What if the very definition of money could be changed overnight? And what if becoming a criminal was as simple as holding on to your own property? This isn't a dystopian fantasy. This is a forgotten chapter of American history, a time when the government declared war on an inanimate object. A time when it turned its sights on the savings of its own people. A time when the United States of America came for its citizens' gold. On April 5, 1933, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102. The language was simple, direct, and utterly terrifying. It required all persons to deliver nearly all of their gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates to the Federal Reserve. In exchange, they would receive paper money. The penalty for refusal? A fine of $10,000, 10 years in prison, or both. It was an order that effectively outlawed private ownership of the one asset people trusted in a world of collapse. So the question is not just what happened. The question is why. Why did the land of the free make holding the world's most timeless form of money a federal crime? Was this a desperate, necessary measure to save a nation on the brink of total annihilation? Or was it the single greatest act of financial seizure in American history? To understand the unthinkable, we have to go back to a time of dizzying heights and impossible dreams. The Roaring Twenties, a decade-long party fueled by borrowed money and boundless optimism. The stock market wasn't just a place for bankers, it was a national pastime. Everyone was getting rich. The rules of gravity, it seemed, no longer applied to finance. But beneath the shimmering surface of this new prosperity, the foundations were cracking. The wealth was an illusion, built on a mountain of debt. And in the fall of 1929, the illusion shattered. The crash wasn't a gentle decline, it was a plunge into a dark abyss. Fortunes built over generations vanished in a single afternoon. The ticker tape machines, once symbols of endless growth, became harbingers of doom, spitting out numbers that spelled ruin for millions. The party was over. The Great Depression had begun. The pain spread from Wall Street to Main Street like a contagion. Factories fell silent, fields turned to dust, and then the people turned to the one place they thought their money was safe: the banks. But the banks had been at the same party. They had gambled with their depositors' money, and they had lost. Panic set in. A whisper became a rumor became a stampede. Lines stretched for blocks. People, their faces etched with fear, waited desperately to withdraw their life savings. But for thousands of banks, there was nothing left to give. The doors were chained shut, with a simple, devastating note taped to the glass: closed. In this world of broken promises and worthless paper, only one thing still felt real. Only one thing held the trust of generations: gold. For centuries, gold wasn't just a symbol of wealth, it was wealth itself. Under the gold standard, the US dollar wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a claim check, a promise from the government that you could walk into a bank and exchange that paper for a fixed amount of solid, physical gold. This system anchored the currency. It imposed discipline. A government couldn't simply print money out of thin air, because every dollar needed a corresponding piece of gold locked away in a vault. It was this promise that gave the dollar its power, its stability, its integrity. As the Depression deepened, people lost faith in everything else. They lost faith in stocks, in companies, in banks, and finally, in the paper currency itself. They began to cash in their claim checks. They wanted the real thing. They started pulling gold out of the system, stashing it under floorboards and burying it in backyards. They were not speculators. They were terrified savers trying to hold on to the last remnant of their security. By the time Franklin Delano Roosevelt took the oath of office in March 1933, the nation was on its knees. The banking system was in a state of total collapse. A quarter of the workforce was unemployed. The economy wasn't just shrinking, it was disintegrating. Roosevelt faced a choice. He could honor the gold promise and watch the nation bleed out as the money supply contracted further. Or he could break the promise to save the system. He looked at the American people, hoarding their gold, and saw not savers, but a threat. He saw the very anchor that was meant to provide stability, now dragging the entire ship of state to the bottom of the sea. He knew he had to act. And he knew his actions would have to be radical, swift, and absolute. The first step was to change the narrative. The government needed to turn a virtue into a vice. The prudent saver, the family protecting its wealth, had to be recast as a villain. A new word entered the American lexicon: the hoarder. Suddenly, holding gold wasn't about security. It was about selfishness. It was unpatriotic. Newspapers ran cartoons depicting shadowy figures, clutching bags of gold coins while the nation starved. Government officials gave speeches condemning these unpatriotic citizens who were strangling the country's recovery for their own personal gain. It was a brilliant and brutal campaign of public persuasion. It aimed to isolate anyone who dared to question the government's path. Roosevelt himself took to the airwaves. In his famous fireside chats, he spoke to the American people not as a president, but as a father. His calm, reassuring voice filled living rooms across the country, explaining the complex crisis in simple, moral terms. He told them that the banks were now safe. He told them that their government had a plan. He asked for their trust, and he warned them. He warned that the recovery depended on them, on their willingness to put the nation's needs above their own. He was preparing them for the sacrifice he was about to demand. Behind the scenes, the logic was cold and calculated. The Federal Reserve, the nation's central bank, was trapped. Its hands were tied by the gold standard. To fight the deflationary spiral of the Depression, it needed to increase the money supply to pump credit into the dying economy. But it couldn't. For every new dollar it wanted to create, it needed more gold in its vaults. Yet people were doing the exact opposite. They were pulling gold out, forcing the Fed to shrink the money supply even further, tightening the noose around the economy's neck. The government's plan was simple. It needed to get the gold back. All of it. It needed to break the link between the citizen and their gold, so it could seize control of the monetary system itself. The weeks leading up to April 1933 were filled with a quiet dread. Roosevelt had already declared a national bank holiday, shutting down every bank in the country to stop the bleeding. It was a temporary measure, but it sent a clear signal. The old rules no longer applied. The government was willing to suspend the normal functions of society to achieve its goals. For the average family, the situation was bewildering. Their bank was closed. Their future was uncertain. The only tangible wealth they might have left was a handful of gold coins, perhaps an inheritance, or the fruits of a lifetime of labor. And now the radio was telling them that holding on to this last piece of security was an act of treason. They were caught in an impossible bind. Do you trust the reassurances of a government that had overseen the collapse of the entire banking system? Or do you protect your own family, and in doing so, risk being labeled an enemy of the state? The tension was building not just in the halls of power, but at kitchen tables across America. A financial earthquake was coming. The only question was when the tremors would finally hit. The earthquake struck on April 5th. Executive Order 6102 was not a request. It was a demand, backed by the full force of the federal government. The text was unambiguous. Every person, Every partnership, every corporation was commanded to turn over their gold. There were minor exceptions for dentists, jewelers, and a small allowance for collectors. But the message was clear: your gold is no longer yours. It belongs to the government now. The deadline was less than a month away, May 1st, 1933. After that, anyone found in possession of more than $100 in gold coin would be a criminal. Imagine the scene. The same people who had lined up in desperation to get their money out of the banks were now lining up to turn their most precious assets over to them. They walked in with heavy bags of gold coins, the sound of real money, and walked out with stacks of crisp, new Federal Reserve notes. Paper in exchange for gold. A promise in exchange for substance. They were paid the official price, $20.67 for every troy ounce. It was the law. And most people, whether through patriotism, trust, or fear, complied. The government's plan was a stunning success. Gold poured into the Treasury's vaults. The nation's gold reserves swelled, consolidating monetary power in Washington on a scale never seen before. But the story doesn't end there. The true shock, the real revelation, was yet to come. Once the government had the people's gold safely locked away, it changed the rules of the game. In January 1934, Congress passed the Gold Reserve Act. With the stroke of a pen, President Roosevelt redefined the dollar. He raised the official price of gold to $35 an ounce. It was a massive, overnight devaluation of the U.S. dollar. Think about what this meant. A citizen who had dutifully turned in 1 ounce of gold had received $20.67. Just a few months later, that same ounce of gold, now sitting in the government's vault, was officially worth $35. In an instant, the paper currency that citizens had been forced to accept lost over 40% of its purchasing power in terms of gold. Anyone who had obeyed the law was effectively robbed of a huge portion of their savings. The government, meanwhile, saw the value of its newly acquired gold hoard increase by nearly 70%. This wasn't just a confiscation, it was a calculated transfer of wealth from the people to the state. The profit from this revaluation created a multi-billion-dollar slush fund that would help finance Roosevelt's New Deal programs. The government didn't just take the gold, it profited immensely from the very act of taking it. Not everyone complied, of course. Some sued the government, leading to the famous Gold Clause cases. The lawsuits went all the way to the Supreme Court. In a deeply divided and controversial ruling, the court ultimately sided with the government, validating its power to override private contracts and control the nation's currency. Others chose a different form of resistance. They defied the order in secret, burying their coins in coffee cans and hiding them in walls. They passed their gold down through generations, a forbidden inheritance, a tangible symbol of defiance against an act they saw as pure tyranny. The Great Gold Confiscation was complete. The government had not only seized the nation's gold, but had also severed the direct link between the currency and the people who used it. The dollar was no longer a claim check for gold. It was a token of government policy. The events of 1933 may seem like ancient history, a relic from a desperate time, impossible to imagine today. But the precedent it set and the questions it raised are more relevant now than ever. Executive Order 6102 was the beginning of the end for the gold standard. The final official link between the dollar and gold was severed by President Nixon in 1971, turning the U.S. dollar into a pure fiat currency. It is backed by nothing physical, only by the trust and confidence people have in the government that issues it. This shift fundamentally changed the nature of money. It gave central banks the power to create currency without restraint, a power they have used on an unimaginable scale. Today, we don't talk about gold hoarding. We talk about quantitative easing and stimulus packages. Sanitized terms for creating trillions of dollars out of thin air. The goal is the same as it was in 1933, to manage the economy, to fight deflation, to fund government spending. But the result is also the same: a slow, steady erosion of the currency's purchasing power. A hidden tax on every saver. The playbook from 1933 is being used again, just with different tools. But the new tools may be even more powerful, more invasive. We are rapidly moving towards a cashless society. Physical cash, like gold coins, offers privacy and anonymity. It is a tool of commerce that exists outside the direct control of the banking system. But digital transactions create a permanent, traceable record. Every coffee we buy, every bill we pay is monitored and recorded. And now, governments around the world are developing a new form of money: central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. This isn't just digital money like we use today. This is programmable money. Money that the government can control directly. They could potentially track every single transaction. They could place limits on what you can buy or where you can spend. They could even program your money to expire if you don't use it, forcing you to spend rather than save. Think about the power this represents. In 1933, the government had to pass a law, issue a threat, and physically collect a tangible asset. In a future with a CBDC, a similar confiscation wouldn't require force. It could be done with a few lines of code. A bank holiday could become a permanent state of control. The Great Gold Confiscation teaches us a crucial lesson. When governments face a severe crisis, the rights of the individual, including property rights, can become secondary to the perceived needs of the state. The definition of money, the rules of ownership, the very concept of savings, all of it can be changed by decree. The question we face today is not whether the government would ever seize our gold again. The question is, in a world of digital currency and total surveillance, would they even need to? Executive Order 6102 was eventually repealed in 1974. Americans are once again free to own gold. Yet the story remains a scar on the nation's history, a cautionary tale, largely unspoken and untaught. Was it a necessary evil, a pragmatic choice that pulled the United States back from the brink of collapse and allowed the New Deal to rebuild the country? Many would argue yes. They would say that in times of ultimate crisis, leaders must make impossible choices, and that the sanctity of the gold standard was a small price to pay for the survival of the nation. Or was it a fundamental betrayal? A moment when the government broke its most sacred promise to its people, violating property rights and seizing wealth under the guise of public good. A dangerous precedent that centralized power and forever altered the relationship between the citizen and the state? The truth is, it was likely both. It was a desperate act in a desperate time. But it was also an act that revealed a profound truth about power and money. It forces us to ask what money truly is. Is it an independent store of value, a form of private property that we control? Or is it merely a tool of public policy, a token that the government allows us to use, and which it can alter, devalue, or even seize at will? The story of the Great Gold Confiscation is the story of that question being answered, not with a debate, but with an order. The legacy of 1933 is not just in the vaults of Fort Knox. It is in the deep-seated skepticism that many people feel toward central banks and government promises. It is in the quiet understanding that the rules can be changed at any time without our consent. History never repeats itself exactly. But its echoes are all around us, in every debate about debt ceilings, in every discussion of inflation, in every step toward a purely digital, state-controlled currency. The conflict between individual financial freedom and the power of the state is not a relic of the past. The struggle over who controls money and what that money represents is the defining struggle of our time. The Great Gold Confiscation wasn't just an event, it was a warning, and it's a warning that we forget at our own peril.